Across the country, Confederate monuments continue to be pulled down at a speed unimaginable just weeks ago. The history is clear. The state-sponsored decision to enslave humans is arguably the most painful act in the history of America. Yet some say that these monuments that glorify the Confederacy are not just about slavery and racism, that they're about history and heritage. As these monuments continue to tumble, our Will Carr has been traveling the last few days across the Deep South, where emotions are raw about what to do and how to treat this painful chapter of history.
They're sparking palpable anger across the United States. They're the faces in communities that can hide in broad daylight. Many residents we met admit that before George Floyd's death, they never even noticed these chiseled and controversial figures. But for those who have, monuments, especially Confederate monuments, can spark a range of emotions, everything from honor to hate.
Take them down! Take them down!
Over the weekend in New Orleans, a group ripped down a statue of John Mcdonough, a wealthy pre-Civil War slave owner who helped fund the city's public school system. The protesters then rolled the bust into the Mississippi River.
It's time for these statues to go. What the death of George really represented was the straw that broke the camel's back.
There are roughly 780 Confederate monuments in public spaces across the United States, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Some cities, including Jacksonville, Florida, have preemptively started to take theirs down.
This is a symbol of white supremacy and hate that was put up in the Jim Crow days, and black people know that. Removing and moving these statues from public property is the first step to reconciliation and to healing.
Here in Gulfport, Mississippi, there is a massive monument of a Confederate soldier. You can see at the bottom it says, "Lest we forget," and on the side that it was unveiled in October of 1911. That's 46 years after the end of the Civil War. But 1911 was a big year for Confederate monuments going up in a number of states. Across the South, many Confederate monuments were erected first during the Jim Crow era, then while the KKK flourished during the Civil Rights era. Critics say monuments were meant to intimidate, while supporters believe they were built to remember.
I do believe that those monuments were put up in good faith by people who wanted to honor what they perceived to be the sacrifice of their own flesh and blood.
Bruce Roberts, like many others in the South, isn't shy about his Confederate pride. He's holding the state flag of Mississippi, the only state flag in the United States that still incorporates the Confederate battle flag.
I still think that this should be our state flag. I don't think it should be offensive.
But Gulfport city leaders and some residents disagree.
That flag is recognized as hatred and racism, and it needs to be taken down, put in a museum like a lot of other older artifacts.
On Tuesday, the Gulfport City Council voted to take down the Mississippi flag and replace it with a neutral Magnolia flag. Are you sensitive, though, to people saying at this point, especially in the context of our present day and everything that's going on, people saying this is really something that's bothering us right now?
Well, if somebody says that they are, offended people of goodwill, if they are offended and they don't like it, I mean, I do have to be cognizant of that.
It sounds like you have your beliefs, but you also have an open mind and are willing to have a conversation.
I realize that yes, and part of the conversation is that we would like the true history of the South and, frankly, of the Confederacy to be known and to be explored.
Supporters like Bruce believe the legacy of the Confederacy is being turned into one based on hate and racism, even though the facts are clear that the Confederacy fought in large part to keep black men, women, and children enslaved. Families were split in the process. 620,000 on both sides died.
If we just can't agree, then at some point, with the democratic process, then, okay, if we're going to change things, let's change them, but let's do it in an orderly fashion, and we can do it without mob violence, and we can do it without disrespecting one another.
Down the street, we found Spencer Schultz and his brother Jared getting haircuts. Spencer's heading into the Army after graduating from a high school not far from that Confederate monument that's next to the county courthouse.
I think statues kind of idolize those figures. And I don't think we should idolize people that own slaves.
It shouldn't really be outside. It should be somewhere to memorialize at least soldiers, but not what they stood for.
But proving this isn't a so-called black and white issue, Avery Sullivan says he's fine with the monument.
To me, it's just a part of our history, so it really doesn't bother me that much.
It's not about that. It's about the people.
It's a debate striking cities across the country. In Mobile, Alabama, city leaders just ignored state law when they decided to take down a statue of a Confederate naval officer, sparking anger from members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, a nonprofit made up of descendants of Confederate soldiers, including Arnold, a veteran himself who didn't want to give us his last name.
If you would speak to veterans of different wars, not that they would have the same political or social views or opinions, but most of us, I do believe, I'm not speaking for anyone but myself, but I believe most of us respect the dignity and honor of the other service.
When you hear people say that the Civil War is linked to hate, linked to slavery, linked to oppression, you think what?
Well, there wasn't a civil war. The war between the states was two democratic republics, one primarily industrial in its economic interest, one primarily agrarian in its economic interest.
And when you hear people say that's linked to hate,
why is the soil and the climate linked to hate? The Northern Union practiced slavery throughout the world.
As a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, Arnold is wearing a pin with the Confederate battle flag.
When Latvia declared its independence from the Soviet Union, if you looked out in that crowd, you see there's a Confederate battle flag. It's a symbol known around the world for people seeking freedom.
But Dylan Roof also associated himself with the Confederate battle flag, and he went into a black church and killed a number of people. When something like that happens, I mean, does that take away from your feelings of it or water down?
Well, what if he had been flying a Lithuanian flag instead of a battle flag?
Well, then we would be having that conversation.
No, we would.
The Confederate symbol is no stranger to New Orleans, a city known for its diverse culture, rich food, and of course, Mardi Gras. Once home to the largest slave market in the United States, after the Civil War, New Orleans erected Confederate monuments across the city. But in 2017, at the direction of then-Mayor Mitch Landrieu, the city took down a handful.
There's a difference between reverence and remembrance. We should always remember so that we never repeat. That's a whole lot different than using a prominent public space to revere people for doing something that, in my opinion, should not be revered.
This is Lee Circle in the heart of downtown New Orleans. Back in 1884, a bronze statue to Robert E. Lee was erected at the top of that monument. But in 2017, that statue was taken down. For the past 3 years, the city's been discussing what should come next.
When these Confederate statues went up, it wasn't a community decision. It was the decision of certain groups of people, and those were the white people in power.
Now some groups are calling for more statues like President Andrew Jackson in the French Quarter to come down, sparking more conflict in the Big Easy.
I just view it as an attack on our history. It's an attack on things that are not going to improve the plight of the people in New Orleans, which is what we should be focused on. How do we make life better here for all people, African Americans, white, all people in New Orleans, in a city that's poor and got a lot of problems.
Critics say the history is ugly. Would you concede that?
I would say it's certainly a history that is got some terrible things about some of these people and some things that were pretty exemplary.
Local radio show host Jeff Carrere points out that after the war, General P.G.T. Beauregard, whose statue was taken down in 2017, advocated for voting rights for former slaves. Beauregard, though, according to historians, thought blacks were, quote, ignorant and could be persuaded to vote his way.
I understand the problems with glorifying the Civil War. I don't want to do that. But it's part of our history. And I just think it should be recognized along with other parts of our history and make it even more of an attraction for people.
Let's look at that history, right? It's ugly. It's very ugly. It's state violence, and it's intimidation, and it's denial of political power to people across race.
But now some are taking history into their own hands. Remember that bust of John Mcdonough that sank to the bottom in the Mississippi? That statue was later fished out by a separate group of white men with God Bless America playing in the background. It's unclear where the statue is tonight.
And Will Carr joins us now live from Jasper, Alabama. And Will, we keep hearing throughout your story about history, and I want to drill down on that for a moment because you're learning that the history of the Civil War and how it was taught may have been altered in large swaths in the South by design.
So I'm going to give you both sides of this, Lindsay. Nobody disputes that the United Daughters of the Confederacy put up monuments like the one behind me all across the South in the early 20th century that aligned with the Jim Crow era. Now, historians also say the same group went into schools here in the South and tried to change facts about the Civil War, and that those changes led to some of the talking points that we've all heard for decades. Now, the people who support those monuments and support the Confederacy point to that old saying that history is in the eye of the beholder. They say that the North won, so they had their own set of facts coming out of the war. So the people in the South here had their version of what happened, and they wanted to get that into the school systems and into the conversation moving forward with history. Lindsay.
And obviously, some of the people who you spoke with, they want to make sure that these monuments stay, despite the pain and anguish of the legacy of slavery and what it leaves many, the stain, I guess, that it leaves on millions of us. Is there a middle ground?
So that's a question we have asked in city after city, town after town. A lot of people, like you mentioned, are entrenched. They either want these statues to stay up, or like you saw in New Orleans, they want them in a river. But there is a middle ground. People we've spoken to on both sides of this issue who say, look, if they can't stay up and if they can't go in a river like you saw in New Orleans, maybe you could put them in a museum. There's actually one in Biloxi called Beauvoir. They told me that actually they would like to see them up, but if they can't stay up, they are willing to take those statues so that the people who want to go and honor those statues can. Lindsay.
Really interesting historical perspective there. Will Carr, thank you so much for your reporting.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.